Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Cataldo, Curator of Manuscripts at the American Antiquarian Society, which is located in central Massachusetts on Nipmuc lands. Welcome to this, the second panel of AAS's virtual conference, Textual Editing and the Future of Scholarly Editions, a conference on the bicentennial of James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy. We are grateful to the Cooper Edition and the Bibliographical Society of America for supporting this event. I'm pleased to introduce the keynote and moderator for this panel, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon. Elizabeth is Distinguished Professor of English at Northeastern University and is also the founding co-director of the NULab for Maps, Texts, and Networks, which conducts research in the fields of digital humanities and computational social sciences. She teaches classes in early American and Atlantic World literary studies, as well as literature and social justice, theatrical performance, and gender studies. She is the author of New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World, 1659 to 1859, Duke University Press, 2014, which received the Barnard Hewitt Award for Outstanding Research from the American Society of Theater Research. She is also the author of The Gender of Freedom, Fictions of Liberalism in the Literary Public Sphere, Stanford University Press 2004, which won the Heyman Prize for Outstanding Publication in the Humanities at Yale. And together with Michael Drexler, she is co-editor of The Haitian Revolution and the Early U.S., Histories, Geographies, and Textualities, University of Pennsylvania Press 2016. She is also the co-director of the Futures of American Studies Institute at Dartmouth. Her work in the field of digital humanities includes projects involving text mining and mapping of early African American texts and slave narratives, digital archival work on early Caribbean texts, and work mapping the reprinting of articles in 19th century US newspapers. She is one of the founders of the award-winning Our Marathon Project, a crowdsourced online archive of the Boston Marathon bombings. She is co-founder and co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, an open access resource engaged in exploring the decolonization of digital archives. Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here. I'm super excited to see the faces of the co-panelists here and looking forward to what you have to say. And I also want to thank the speakers from the previous panel who laid out such wonderful issues and questions that I think that this panel will be building on as well. So I'm going to launch into my presentation here. I'm going to share my screen. And let's go. Okay. So the kind of the key concept that I will be talking about, this panel is about textual editing in the classroom. And I will be sharing some work that I've done around textual editing in the classroom. But the larger framework that I want to begin by introducing is about the concept of text networks and thinking about text in new ways that are facilitated by digital editing. And so let me start out by beginning with the sort of well-known image of from Robert Darnton of book history. And one of the things that this image does for me is to help think about essentially the decomposition of the book. I mean, it's about the composition of the book, right? But it's also about the decomposition of the book, because when you look at this map, this diagram, what you are not looking at is a picture of an author in a garret or a Norton edition, right? There's a way in which I think students and many people kind of think you go from the author in the garret to the Norton edition, right? And what happens if that is, if that's not the story? So I want to kind of frame what I'm saying here is as thinking about the core concept of unbundling authorship and unbinding the codex, right? So to think about the ways in which we might want to challenge the notion of a singular author, singular authorship, as well as challenge the idea of text as codex, and particularly challenge the idea of codex with the name of the author on the spine, right? And what's at stake for me here is really, this work is really at the intersection of the digital humanities, of book history, and the work of moving beyond white canonical authorship and colonial knowledge systems. And so I want to begin by referencing a number of works that are kind of crucial to my thinking here, and flesh it out just a little bit. The first is by my colleague, Nicole Aljo, who is also the co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive with me. And this is a book of hers that's really been crucial to the work of the intellectual project of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. And that's her book, Creole Testimonies, Slave Narratives from the British West Indies. And that in that book, she's really looking, she uses this concept of testimonia rather than text. And she's very interested in the way in which thinking about the slave narrative as a text that is often embedded in a colonial text, and what it would mean to disembed that text and understand that that text in new terms, as opposed to belonging to, let's say, Brian Edwards or the man whose name is on the spine of the codex. So how might we recognize other forms of authorship, other forms of textuality, and other forms of voice that are present in different forms? Ryan Cordell, another colleague of mine, this is an article in American Literary History, and he kind of talks about this concept, what he calls the network author, which again is sort of, I don't want to call it the death of the author, because it's not so much that, it's not the kind of Roland Barthes move so much as it is thinking about authorship as like being spread out, residing in multiple locations. And Ryan's work comes out of his own work on the in digital humanities on the Viral Text Project, which is digitally mapping the reprinting of articles and materials across 19th century newspapers, which was very common. And to suggest then that authorship is as much a question of editorship and circulation as it is a question of, putting pen to paper, for instance. The next work here is by Susan Gilman and Kirsten Silva Grush, who we just heard Kirsten give a wonderful presentation. And her, this contribution here is the Hemispheric Text Network. This is a brilliant article. Unfortunately, it's all too difficult to get your hands on, but I highly recommend it. It's sort of a thinking about the text in terms of networks across locations, across languages, and across genres. And it's an idea that has been very generative for me, and I'll show you next a sort of version of trying to think about that digitally. And then finally, Derek Spires' recent book, The Practice of Citizenship. His work, among others, really points to the way of thinking about, in exploring African-American authorship, it's often profoundly collaborative work lodged in ephemeral kinds of materials, sketches, periodicals, so forth. So again, it's work in which authorship is not located in a single figure, and it's not bound in the codex. So in order to make those texts and those histories visible, we have to move beyond, again, the singular author and the codex. So another thing I'd like to kind of point out here is that the Derek's work is very connected to the Colored Conventions Project, which is a digital project. Ryan's work is very connected to the Viral Text Project. Nicole's to the ECDA. So I don't think it's an accident that there are these connections to thinking about new modes of text and authorship that come to us by way of the new formations of the digital. Okay, so now I want to look at a kind of text network example. And this is an exhibit. It is not yet live yet, but it is, I gave Kevin the link to put in the chat, and I'll go to it. I'm going to share my screen now on the internet so that you can see. I'll share a different screen. Okay, so that I can kind of scroll through it with you. Go away. Okay, so this is an exhibit that a number of graduate students. Oh, that's the wrong thing. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can share the right thing. Here we go. I was sharing the PowerPoint and not the Safari. Okay. This, damn. Okay, this is not. Let me try one more time. Sorry about this. Oh, I think I'm clicking on the wrong window. Yes, that's it. All right, so this is an exhibit that was put together by a former graduate student, Kate Simpkins, who's now at Auburn University, Laura Johnson, a current graduate student, Danny Bryce, who was an undergraduate at Brandeis, who wanted to work with the ECDA. Danny's now a graduate student at Duke. And this is an exhibit that is based around the work on the figure Francois Makandal, who was anti-slavery revolutionary. You can see a little, he lived in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and he's kind of credited with being, with staging a revolt that had originary force for the Haitian Revolution. Now, the question of Makandal Imprint is a really difficult one because the materials about Makandal range from everything from court documents to newspaper documents to novels to pantomimes to plays to in fact there's a video game about Makandal as well today. There's an Assassin's Creed that's about Makandal. So and they're in all different languages, right? All different lodged in all different archives. So the text network makes a tremendous amount of sense as a way to think about Makandal. And I want to just go to one of the links here, genre and geography. And this is a map that Laura Johnson put together of different texts that are about Makandal. And you can click on one of them and you can see, okay, here, this was in Canada. And it's letters. It's in Aix-en-Provence. You can click here. You can see a Saint-Domingue text from 1766, which was an advertisement. You can go over to France, and you can see a novel by Neufchâteau, Gil Blas, that you may know. So this suggests the ways in which these texts are distributed across the globe. And let me just read this passage from this website that I'm very proud to say that that I did not write. Students of mine wrote. Traditional means of ordering and representing historic documents focus on information about the text. When was a text published? Who is the author? What is the genre? As we compile the texts of Makandal's narratives, the materials spanned a wide range of dates, authors, and genres. And then jumping down, the distinctions between primary and secondary sources defines a certain type of knowledge and perspective about narrative and history and our relationship to it. It prioritizes primary documents in ways that easily erase circulation, myth, and legacy. In the context of Makandal's narrative, many of the texts in this network are tied to colonial power, from where they were written and published to where original documents are held in archives and libraries. If instead of using primary and secondary criteria to sort and organize the texts, but genre, what additional information can we learn? What is the distribution of text in this network by genre, and how does genre relate to colonial power and archives? So this is kind of one example of thinking through the text network. And I'm going to share one. Now I'm going to move sort of more directly to the classroom and to an example of textual editing in the classroom. Okay. And I believe this should also be in the okay, let me try one more time, sorry. All right. This should also be in the chat, the link to Literature and Digital Diversity. And I encourage you to check it out and steal anything you want to steal if you want to teach this class. So the class, part one of the class, as it says here, we focus on TEI text encoding using William Shakespeare's The Tempest and several of its adaptations to ground our explorations of this foundational digital humanities methodology. So I'm going to just walk you through really quickly this assignment. The assignment is we ask students to locate an archival document from the 17th century that's related to The Tempest in any obscure way that they choose. And then we put them in teams to have them work together on encoding these using the Textual Encoding Initiative. And as a group, we ask them to decide upon an editorial policy. So they have to make decisions about whether they want to regularize terms, how they want to handle textual errors, how do they want to handle images, how will you encode gendered or racialized terms and concepts. And so they have to both encode the text and then give us an editorial statement about their decisions about what they did. So, and then you can scroll down to the sample projects. So this was spring, this was actually fall of 2020. We had texts, these are the texts that they chose. Practices of enslavement, colonial encounters with Native Americans. And here I'll just call on one of them. This is a version that a student did. And then we invite them to encode. You see the color coding here. They make choices about what terms to foreground, and then we give them a simple schema to put it up on the web with the things highlighted that they were interested in. And then finally, we add these to a collectively annotated version of The Tempest. So we take the text, and then we ask them to connect it as a note. So if you click on that note, then you can see, let's see right here, note number 4. I pity thee thing or other. This is the note that the student wrote. Even though Rudyard Kipling would not be born for another 200 years, the notion of the white man's burden was certainly evident in the 17th century, both as part of the Tempest and in England. And then this is, for an example of what Kipling was referring to, see an epistle to the Christian Indians. And this is the TEI, the edited version that the student put together. You see, this student actually made choices to include the long S's. And then just quickly, I'm going to show you their oxygen. This is their encoding. And so we asked them to comment out their encoding. So here the student says, I wanted to create my own set of tags to account for the heavy amount of religious references, so on and so forth. Here I wanted to call Guyana a region instead of have it be a place name or a country. So I'm going to stop the share here. But what I want to suggest is that we're inviting the students to participate in creating a text network. The things that we foreground in doing this is that we ask them to make good decisions and to explain their decisions, to justify their decisions. And finally, the other thing that we emphasize, and this really speaks to Joycelyn's earlier point, is that editing a text is actually making a new text. And when you make a new text, you have to make lots of decisions and you have to justify them, and they have to be intellectually sound, so that this is intense intellectual work, right? It's not just typing. Okay, so, oh great, the Gilman and Grush is in the chat, so you all have a copy of that. All right, I'm now going to pass it off to our first panelist, James Ascher, and I'll begin by introducing him. James Ascher just earned his doctorate in English at the University of Virginia, where he studied bibliography and restoration to 18th century English literature, focusing on printed forms of meaning, poetry, and natural philosophy. He has been both a Praxis Fellow and a Presidential Fellow in data science. He was a Bradley Fellow and co-founded the Public Humanities Lab for the Institute of Humanities and Global Cultures. During most summers, he teaches collation tutorials at Rare Book School. This summer, he'll also be continuing his doctoral research at the Royal Society with a fellowship from the Bibliographical Society of America and the Catherine F. Pantzer Jr. Scholarship from the Bibliographical Society.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you for a wonderful presentation. I really liked your phrase, text in new terms, which I promised I didn't know you were going to say, but I think might be a good byword for what I'm going to show as well. I'm going to try to share my screen, and that's always a funny little dance. So if all goes well, Elizabeth, are you looking at one slide, not two slides? One slide. Fantastic. Oh no, I'm looking at the two slides now. Okay, let me fix that. See, every day it decides which screen is number one, and you just have to kind of go with it. Okay. Is it one slide now, Elizabeth? Sarah says one. Great. Fantastic. We're on the right side. Everything's good. I'm going to talk to you today about some fruits of my dissertation work, which was principally on the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, which has continuously published for centuries and documents a great deal of human culture. Rather than seeking new text in new terms, I think I'm going to show you an old text that actually contains new terms that we've previously not paid attention to. I'll give you some citations as we go along, but the text begins with a question. As one does, I was reading the Philosophical Transactions and I come across this passage from May 1685, an account of a sort of sugar made of the juice of maple in Canada. The savages in Canada, in the time of that the sap rises in the maple, make an incision in the tree by which it runs out. And after that, they have evaporated 8 pounds of the liquor. There remains 1 pound sweet and as much sugar as that which is got out of the canes. Part of the same sugar is sent to be refined at Rovin. The savages have practiced this art longer than any now living among them can remember. There's made with the sugar a very good syrup, and it goes on and on. But the bit that struck me, I'll zoom in. The savages have practiced this art longer than any now living among them can remember. I was struck by the contrast of this kind of sneer word, the S word here, and then living among them can remember. And I posed to myself, what can be known about this article? In particular, it's not signed. More on that in a second. We don't know the source. It's just this kind of report at the beginning of one of these issues. So being me, I looked to forensics as a model. And in fact, forensics as a model which concerns traces left by contact. In this case, I mean textual traces, but the basic principle is two things that were once in contact often leave some sort of trace one on the other. And as we're at a conference on textual criticism, I think you can see the metaphor here. But the place where the most state-of-the-art forensics are happening deal with computers, right? So this is the article I looked at, a complete formalized knowledge representation model for advanced digital forensic timeline analysis, which as far as I can tell is the most state-of-the-art one that I can apply to this problem. And in particular, it's important because it's automated. The automated is not useful for me because I'm not automating my process, but in forcing something to be automated, like a digital humanities project, you have to think through it very carefully. And the tool in there, I promise to get through the forensics, the models quickly, is this basic model, right? Events, which you see in the upper left, occur in time, and they involve objects and subjects, objects being things, subjects being people involved in the event. But all we have left, you and I, are what they call footprints or evidence. Time is also in different granularities. In their case, they're looking at computers, and some might be to the second, some might be to the millisecond. They may be in different time zones. They may be in different places. In my case, we've got centuries, months, and other forms of uncertainty. But what's useful in this model, and what I want you to see, is this concept of footprint. The event occurs in time, involving objects and subjects, and those are removed from us. In their case, they're looking at crime, they're looking at forensic investigation, but this is essentially a form of standing aside from the event and looking only at the footprints, and how do we establish a chronology. They use this thing called an Allen algebra. It's a Boolean algebra that allows comparisons of intervals and automates reasoning using imprecise timing. Their problem is essentially that there's some illicit, by which they mean illegal, event that occurred in the past, and it must be attributed to some subject. So there's a file, it's illegal somehow, maybe it's, defamatory, and they want to say, okay, you did this, and you say, well, I don't know how it got on the computer. Basically, this model says, okay, we've got a log file from your router, we've got one from the telephone company, we've got this thing from your computer, each incomplete and unreliable in different ways, but we can relate them using this kind of, this algebra of intervals, right? And so those intervals actually really remind me of Lance and James's editing for The Spy that we saw earlier on, which I thought was fantastic. But it's, again, just kind of a very formalized version of this. They also carefully define correlation for us. Their formal definition is two events are correlated. It means that one event is linked to the other on the basis of multiple criteria, in particular, use of common resources, participation of a common person or process, in the temporal position of events. So these are important. Common resources, objects, person or processes, common subjects, and the temporal position. One thing has to, somehow occur before the other. And they refine this, of course, into their definition of causality, which bugged me forever. X causes E means that X has to happen to allow E to happen. And I thought, well, that's not causality, right? Like, it has to happen for this thing to happen. But, if you go back and you think, we can do this in the question and answer about, the Aristotelian causality, right? There's material and efficient causes and whatnot. It is, in fact, like, what is it to say, if this thing didn't happen, this other thing couldn't happen? And it's this definition of causality that actually gives me purchase in this earlier problem. How did this article get here? And can we trace the footprints that led to its placement in this issue of the philosophical transactions? So those of you familiar with bibliography will recognize on the bottom half of the screen a collational formula for number 171 of the philosophical transactions in which this article appears. What I want to draw your attention to is at the beginning, we have 2A2, and at the end is 2F2. Those superscript 2s mean they're two single leaves folded like this. They're what's called a half sheet. This was normally done to economize paper or to fit something in. And so we have actually our first footprint. Something strange is going on at the beginning and ending of this issue in which this article appears. Let's take a look. So the issues were designed to have the frontispiece folded out to display along with the title so that you could look at it and get excited about the contents, maybe buy a copy. Here we have this lovely urn. But the bit I want you to notice is right here. The very first article is our account of a sort of sugar made from the juice of maple in Canada, which if you turn the page, you can see the article right here. Note that the bottom is quite spaced out. There's this rule there, and there's just like a huge gap. And on the recto, the next page, note 2, the date there is 1684. The date of this issue is 1685, May. Watch those dates, they're important. So here we already know that time is loose, right? We can go back a year with an article, which really doesn't help us figure out what's going on with this first one. We turn the page again. We see after this second article, another huge gap. And then we see that 2B, those 2B letters, which tell us at the beginning of the body proper. The reason I point out these gaps is they're both space filling techniques. This suggests that there was something, we needed something to stick in here, which suggests this kind of reason for some letter from 1684 in this mystery letter. So let's find more evidence. Let's look for more footprints. Where can we go for a log file of the 17th century? That's right, Birch's History of the Royal Society of London, wherein he documents the minutes and events occurring in the Royal Society. Here I have a page on the right, which I'll zoom into shortly, just to orient you to the book. And what I want you to notice here in particular is on the top, we have a discourse was read. In the middle, we have a letter from Monsieur Justel. That's probably Henri Justel. That matters later. And on the bottom, we have a footnote about the discourse saying it was printed in the Philosophical Transactions number 170. Haha. Philosophical Transactions 171, Philosophical Transactions 170. We begin to have this Allen algebra effect where we're triangulating where the thing is. This, of course, is in February 18, 1685. So let's look around. If we go forward in the book, we find another footnote later referring to Philosophical Transactions 169, March 18th. So we get kind of this frame. It's about 40 pages that you can read very carefully if you'd like, but I've done the work for you, finding eventually this, which records the events that occurred at the meeting of the Royal Society. Mr. Aston produced a large piece of brown sugar delivered to him by Monsieur Justel. And I'm almost 100% certain it's Henri Justel. It was said to be made by the savages of Canada, who at that time, when the juice rises in the maple, you get the French translation, let it out, and evaporate it to an eighth part, at which time, right, and we see the same language. The reason I'm fairly sure it's Henri is he left Louis XIV's court in 1681 to be William III's librarian, which is what he's doing in London in 1685 with something that seems to be sent by new French colonists. This was March 2nd, more footprints. You go back to the French National Archives and you can find this very famous bit of the king advising the new French settlers how to deal with the fact that they don't have enough people around. My very rough translation is to build the colony peacefully by civilizing the Algonquins, the Hurons, and other Indians who embrace Christianity, and to convince them to establish themselves in community with the French and to educate their children in our customs. Now, this is important. This is 1666, so way earlier. And this moment has kind of been studied. There's two wonderful articles, Yves Landry and Salia Bellimusos. The first one on the left, I want you to see merely that we have a shocking rate of reproduction among the Canadians, not entirely explained in 1993. And Belmisos argues that, in fact, there's assimilation going on. Prior to about 1686, people were intermarrying. People were building families with natives, First Nations people in Canada. So the new French settlers did not kind of see themselves as othering. They saw themselves as people that could be recruited. So this gives us an interesting frame of footprints. April 1666, these other sauvages. We have February, March 1685, the savages of Canada, and then we have May 1685, the savages, big S. And it's worth noting here, of course, the French word doesn't quite have our connotation. It may be wild people or people who are not, of the city. The Sylvacatus, the people of the woods. And Henry Oldenburg, who I now think is the one who must have written this piece based on his presence at the meeting and his job as being the editor of the Philtrans to fill the space that needed to be filled. Probably thought nothing of reusing the word savage, which became capitalized. And so there's an interesting question here, right? Someone who was a friend, perhaps family member of a new French settler shared something that their family remembered, their people remembered. And somewhere along the way, it got a big S savage on it. And there's something interesting here. I don't have an answer where that happened, but there's an interesting linguistic thing happening. And I think that tracing these footprints allow us to see the nature, although uncertain, of a certain kind of contribution made by someone in the spirit of community. And I only bring you back to why the forensic model matters to me is this causality. X causes E means that X has to happen to allow E to happen. In this case, we had some friend or family member present a lump of sugar, a physical object that we know moved from New France all the way to London, and then eventually became this textual object. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was terrific. And now we're going to move on to Sonia Di Loreto. Sonia is Associate Professor of American Literature at the University of Torino in Italy, where she teaches courses in the fields of early American literature, 19th century American literature, and transatlantic print culture. One of her most recent publications is Margaret Fuller's Archive, Absence, Erasure, and Critical Work in 19th century in interdisciplinary studies in the long 19th century. She is currently working on a book manuscript on Margaret Fuller's transnational network, which aims at reconstructing the network of communication and the circulation of revolutionary ideas generated during Margaret Fuller's European years. She's also a project manager of the digital humanities project Margaret Fuller's Transnational Archive, and she serves on the editorial board of the Italian Journal of American Studies, ACOMA. Sonia?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks to Ashley and to Kevin for having organized this. I will try to share my screen now. And as you can see okay, hold on. Okay, this is the beginning. Okay, so when I was told about this panel, the first thing that came to mind was the question of the translation. The translation as a different text, and it's a different creature from the original or the various original editions of, say, a novel, for example. So today I would like to address some questions concerning the translations of The Spy in Italian. And this could give us an opportunity to, by using the words that Elizabeth used in her talk, unbundling authorship and also unbinding the codex. So working on translations is another way to be able to do that. I would like to concentrate my attention specifically on the publishing locations, the figure of the translator, and how certain characters get translated or reconstructed or misconstructed. And finally, I would like to mention the possibilities that we now have to create a collaborative edition of a new translation, commenting on my experience of teaching The Spy in an undergraduate course in Italy to students whose first language frequently is not English. And, I would also like to think about the question posed by Kristen Silva-Grues: is a translated edition scholarly, and how can we make it scholarly in a way? Okay, so let me move to this first edition, this first translation of The Spy. So this edition I wasn't able to actually hold in my hand, because the archives are still closed here, but I stole the image from a vendor online. So this is the first translation of The Spy, and it was published in 1828 in Livorno, Leghorn, for English speakers. And we might remember Leghorn as the place where both George Byron and the Shelleys lived. And I would like to stress that this small town here, you can see it's the blue spot there. And so Livorno and Tuscany in general, in the early part of the 19th century, were incredibly important in terms of both welcoming a very diverse and cosmopolitan assortment of foreigners, and also because they contributed to the dissemination of revolutionary ideas. We know, of course, that Cooper and his family visited and lived in Tuscany. But just as another example, we also know that in 1827, and the source here is the Freedom's Journal. So in 1827, the Christophe women, Madame Marie-Louise Christophe and her daughters Amethyst and Athénère, exiled from Haiti, both took residence first in Florence and then in Pisa, where they lived for the rest of their lives. As Anna Scanavini explains, Leghorn was important because of its cultural cosmopolitanism. Commercial activities opened it not only to the US, but also to European liberalism, and in some instances, revolutionism. So it's important, I think, and really interesting to think about this sort of this, what we might consider somehow provincial locales, right, rather than huge centers of dissemination, because these places might be the ones who are producing really interesting stuff. Cooper was a renowned author at the time, and some of his first novels were printed in Leghorn by Francesco Domenico Guerrazzi, a well-known writer and patriot. Now, Guerrazzi was a writer of historical novels. He was a militant revolutionary. He wrote a series of dramas and novels and founded a periodical called L'Indicatore Livornese. So that, I think it's kind of interesting to think what is translatable in the spy in the late 1820s, right? What could be the value of taking up such a work and make it available to Italian readers? Where Italian is a wrong term here, because there is no Italy. To readers who were interested in creating a nation, right? So I think that Harvey Birch is a very interesting character for an Italian patriot, because of some of his characteristics. He's not delegating anything. He's taking upon himself the task to participate, to create the nation. And so I think that could be really interesting and resonate with some of these patriot. Now, this translation got reprinted in Rome in 1834, and I was able to get to this copy, even though you have to excuse my very poor photographic skills here, but this is the same translation that got printed in Rome, and then some of the illustrations. Changed, and I want to concentrate on these changes here. Now, from these photographs, I hope that you can see here. And again, I apologize, it's not very clear, but this is the chapter when Henry Wharton and Harvey Birch are escaping. And you might remember that Henry was in prison, and Harvey convinced Henry to leave the prison once he went there with Caesar. So basically, Henry had to pass as Caesar, his black servant, in order to escape prison. And so he has this disguise. Now, what is interesting here, and something that we can ponder, is that the engraver Raffaele Persichini, who was a famous engraver at the time, chose intentionally, maybe by mistake, I don't know, to treat Wharton's disguise as literally as possible. Now, we see Henry Wharton being kept in character, has a black character here. While in the novel, if we read the novel, that passage, Harvey, as already told Henry Wharton to discard his disguise. So this is just an example to say that the translation doesn't only happen at the level of words, at the level of the text, but there is a material aspect to it that includes the visual art, the illustrations that could be deemed culturally interesting or more interesting than others. Now, there are other translations and different editions, of course, and some of them are very recent. Now, one thing that we can notice, certainly, is that after the 1940s and 50s, Cooper becomes a writer marketed to young readers. And there is an example of another translation of The Spy, and this is a 1949 edition for young readers, really. Now you can see that the translator or the editor, they've changed the title. And so they took the decision to give this book the title, The Secret Agent, L'Agente Segreto, right? And this predates of a few years Ian Fleming's the James Bond, right, figure. So one thing that, this is the, it's a juvenile edition, and you can see how juvenile, maybe you can see it very clearly, but you can see that it's a juvenile edition also because there is an insult marked in yellow. So for non-English, non-Italian speakers, it says "sei un pirla," which means you're an idiot. And so it's really like, very, oriented to a kind of audience. Now, I want to fast forward to a course that I taught a few years ago on the American Revolution and the novel. And it was a survey course for undergraduates where I decided for the first time, since I read it in graduate school, thanks to Meredith McGill, thanks Meredith. So I read The Spy in graduate school, I really loved it. And I finally decided that it was time to teach it. So other texts that we read along with Cooper's novel were Charlotte Temple, Amelia, Slaves in Algiers, Theresa, and others. I was a little hesitant to teach The Spy because of the challenges in language, especially. But then I was really surprised when two students of mine, Eleonora Battagliotti and Matteo Cabassi, they approached me and they told me that they absolutely loved the novel. They did not understand everything, but they were so enthralled that they wanted to translate it. At that time, it really seemed a little bit like, what Emerson told Margaret Fuller, that he couldn't read Italian. So he couldn't read Dante's Vita Nuova. So he was going to translate it into English. And I thought of that practice as a very, a very close approach to understanding a text, right? So the idea, that these students voluntarily wanted to translate, and they did translate it, not the whole thing, but some, a good number of chapters. This made me think that the translation is, of course, something, a fluid text, something in flux, but also it reflects other, moments on political ideas. And so, for example, my students, because of the context of my class, they didn't really pay attention very much to Harvard Birch or George Washington. They didn't really, that for them, that wasn't, they weren't necessarily the most important characters. What they really wanted, because of the discussions that we had in class, they wanted to give Frances Wharton more space, right? And in fact, we identified Frances Wharton as another spy figure, right? So she becomes the spy, in the eyes of this new sort of interpretation. So I want to reteach the text, The Spy, in the next fall, hopefully. And since we've all acquired some familiarity with digital tools and online resources, I'm planning to conceive more complex classroom activities. And I'm going to use, I'm going to use this platform, Manifold. I've used the Great Lawsuit, this edition created by Cristina Catapodis with the CUNY student editions, and my students loved it. They found it really readable and really useful. And I think it will be really an interesting challenge to do a project which will be a bilingual project, which will include the original edition. We have to choose the original edition, of course. And then it would be interesting to have students tackle with their own translations, but also looking at those translations in Italian that are present in local libraries. So my plan is to send out students who have been really stuck and immobile to go and search for these archives and create this kind of complex text, which will include their own contributions, their own critical contribution. And I think this is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Fantastic. And I'm going to move right along to our next talk by Meredith Neuman. Meredith is Associate Professor in the English Department at Clark University, where she teaches early modern and earlier American literature, as well as book history and print culture. Her current project looks at the material textualities of mundane poetry practices in colonial America from 1650 to 1773.
I just want to reiterate all the thanks that everyone has given to the organizers, but also just really awed to be listening to all these great speakers today and tomorrow. So thank you, and thank you in advance. I am feeling a bit odd here. I'm going to be talking about teaching Anne Bradstreet using digitized sources, but I should give a caveat that I am not doing digital humanities. I'm not doing editing. I'm really just like, what else can we do? Especially when faced with a problem in a sense of a kind of an overly canonical text like Anne Bradstreet. Say you are teaching in a survey class, which is going to be my main example today. And you can choose from anthologies, or you can, pick a few poems that's going to represent Anne Bradstreet, Puritan poet, right? And you'll find that the anthology selections really lead you towards domestic Bradstreet, the wife, the mother, right? Things get a little bit better at the seminar level when you can do something like use the standard Hensley edition that has the 1650, the 1678, all the things from the Andover manuscript. Still, those of you who have worked with the very serviceable Hensley edition, still in print from 1967 forward, know that it really flattens out all the editorial decisions and the distinctions between all those different Bradstreets, plural, if you will. There's an excellent article by Margaret Olafson Thixton that I'll be referring out to about why there's a new edition needed. I believe that Thixton's actually done a new edition. I won't be talking about that. I haven't had access to it yet. But what I ended up doing instead is I just started using the things that were already digitized, decided to throw my introductory and intermediate students just like in the deep end. Why don't we just read the 10th Muse 1650 and see what happens? So I'm going to be sharing my screen now. There'll be a link in the chat to this very embarrassing, bare bones, WordPress site that I have abandoned for about 6 years until this week, just so that I could put some links up to the digitized material. Well, what do you get when you give a class of undergraduates the 10th Muse to work with? And this is what you're going to be giving them, is this, digitized version of the poor microfilm. At the advanced level, you can talk about remediation at this point. But even for an undergraduate class, what you can start doing is first to prepare them that it's going to look different, right? You're going to have your long S's and they need to deal with it, right? That spelling is going to be different, that things might be hard to read. So what you want to do is to shift from thinking about read these poems to read around, to invite them to do what we might call discontinuous reading, okay? To read around the way somebody might read around in a poetry book. So that you give them, instead of an assignment of words or pages to read, you give them a time period to be playing within that text. When you come into the classroom, then what you can expect to do is spend a lot of time thinking about the title page. You know, sometimes they want to talk about this bracket here, and that may or may open up a conversation about, you know, Ramian logic in the 17th century. Or what it's likely going to open up is a conversation about her topics, the elements, the constitutions, the ages of man, and the four monarchies. Right. This fundamentally changes what happens when you then turn to the text of her prologue, where she says, I'm not going to sing about captains and kings and wars and you know, nation formation because I'm just a woman. But if you've actually read and spent some time with this frontispiece first, or if you go in and you see that there's hundreds and hundreds of pages on the four monarchies, that you're probably not going to read in its entirety, you read that prologue in a significantly different way. For those of you who are interested in opening up conversations about the materiality of the text, you can begin doing that. You can talk about the publication history, right? How her brother-in-law has taken these manuscript poems and comes back with a print book, and what that might mean to her in the year 1650. Be prepared to have conversation about catchwords, for example. What are all these things at the bottom of the page, right? So you can have a whole bunch of different conversations along those lines. What I do in an undergraduate survey class is I'll spend an entire day just working on Bradstreet's 1650, and then we'll switch over to 1678. Happily, there's a beautiful digitization of it available on archive.org. And then you can start seeing what happens between the 1650 imprint and the 1678 imprint when Bradstreet has added 6 poems, kind of beginning in the pages right before here. But then she dies, and then the family adds additional poems that they think belong. Then you can have a different set of conversation about framing, how Bradstreet understands her edition, like what does it mean to have print publication forced upon you, right? So for example, in the Hensley book, the author to her book from 1678 and the prologue from 1650 get kind of mushed together. And so when she says, thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, you know, it seems like it could refer to the manuscript poems, but it doesn't. It refers to the print, of course. And they think a lot about what it means for the family to decide versus Bradstreet to decide what poems go into that imprint. With a very good digitization like this, you can do things like zoom in, and you can even see how the ink bleeds through. You can see the strike of the print on the page. You can talk about the dimensionality of leaf versus the two-dimensional aspect of the page. And you can talk about printing errors and all kinds of things like that. I decided to go a step further and throw the Andover manuscript at them. Again, this is just as good as digitization gets, done by the Houghton Library at Harvard. And what you can ask students to do as they go in is, again, to allow for the fact that they're going to be reading in different ways, right? Many of the students will be able to read this handwriting. Fewer will be able to read this handwriting. So you can give them some guides, right? For example, when I gave students the Andover manuscript to work with, you introduce it and you say, well, You know, this is a manuscript that Anne Bradstreet begins for her children, that she writes all in prose, and you can read that, and you can actually point them to this page of the manuscript where you see the moment, or not moment, you see the point where Bradstreet's manuscript ends because of her death. And even if the students are not very comfortable reading handwriting, and you might be surprised at how comfortable they can be, they can see that this is a different hand. And it opens up questions, again, as Elizabeth was suggesting at the beginning, about who is the author then of the Andover manuscript, right? The rest of this volume is going to be filled with the son, Simon's, copying in of the mother's poems. So again, the students are looking at Bradstreet over time in the 17th century, looking at 1650, 1678, and then this ambiguous kind of expanded period of manuscript creation that extends past her death. There's a couple of things that I wanted to add at the end here, because I want to save as much time as possible for conversation, that what you can do when you bring this level of kind of just handing over the raw material, the early imprint, the manuscript, if you have access, is it allows the students to get deeper into Bradstreet and to ask much deeper questions about publication, but also about topics, about the formation of her sense of authorship. But it also allows them to fundamentally change how they're thinking, even when later in the semester we might be reading a completely well put together scholarly / classroom edition. So for example, students who have read Bradstreet imprints and Bradstreet manuscripts can then turn to a Penguin edition, say, of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, and read it differently. When we turn to the attestation or the frontispiece that is reproduced here in a mass market, kind of easily available text, they're able to formulate questions about the interaction, the complexities of different forms of media participation in creating texts, right? What does it mean to have that attestation? What does it mean when we can see that Wheatley Peters is clearly referring to manuscript things as well? When we have the letter to the Countess of Huntington before the poem about George Whitefield, it invites us to think about manuscript Wheatley as well as the print Wheatley. As you dive into the material in the appendices in this edition, proposals for a book of poetry that never materializes, variant editions, they're able to see the fluidity and the complex intermediality of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, and to begin to understand. The most advanced students within your classes will start to see the interaction between forms of media that an author might engage, and the relationship to gender, the relationship to race, the relationship to class, and the relationship to status, and to read text in any edition that they encounter in a much more complex way. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Meredith. Our final speaker on the panel today is Sarah Robbins. Sarah Robbins is a PhD candidate in the English department at Yale University. She's also a newly minted junior fellow in the Rare Book School Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. Her research focuses on 19th century American literature with a particular interest in African American authors who revised their own work. Sarah?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Robbins. So before I begin, I would like to also thank everyone. I want to especially thank Ashley Cataldo and Kevin Wisniewski for all of their logistical support as the day got a little nutty. Yeah, and then thanks to the co-panelists for the conversation in advance. And thank you to Elizabeth Maddock Dillon for chairing. And then finally, thank you to the audience for being here. I'm going to skip all of the stuff where I apologize for not actually having taught what I'm going to talk about, and just say I haven't, but I'm sort of working through some questions and problems that I have with a particular text leading into when I will teach it. And actually, Meredith, where you ended is a very interesting point for me to start, because I'm going to be dealing with a text that wants to, in some ways, be a manuscript despite its print status. And so with that, I will get into it. If you are able to see my screen, great. So I'm going to be talking about the bondwoman's narrative today. And that was completed sometime in the 1850s. And as I'm showing in this slide, it was written by a pseudonymous author who claims in the title to be Hannah Crafts, a fugitive slave recently escaped from North Carolina. The book remained in manuscript form until it was brought into print by Henry Louis Gates Jr. in 2002. And since I'm short on time, I'll skip the story of how he got the manuscript. And I also won't cover much of the content, and just briefly say that it's generically hybrid, and it mixes autobiography and fiction, genres like the American slave narrative, Gothic novels, minstrelsy, Dickensian political fiction, and various other things. So though the 19th century manuscript does not call itself a novel, the 2002 printed edition is given that generic distinction, which I'm showing in a slide that depicts a cropped version of the front cover of the printed edition. You can see the little flourishes around a novel. Rather than describe how the plot unfolds, though, I'll instead focus on the editorial theory that undergirded how it first appeared in print. The printed edition of the bondwoman's narrative is rendered in what I call an as-is style. And I'm happy to, if we have time, talk about what as-is insinuates for me. But for now, I'll just show a quick example. As editor, Gates chooses to illustrate the process of the manuscript's composition, at least to some extent. For instance, he opts to represent Craft's textual excisions with strike-throughs like the ones I'm showing in this slide. And throughout the edition, he preserves Craft's spelling and grammatical errors, occasionally offering corrective hints and brackets for readability. He explains in his note on punctuation and spelling that, quote, throughout the text, every effort was made to print the novel as it appeared in the original holograph, end quote. His performance of editorial non-labor seems to have been inspired by what he elsewhere argues makes the manuscript most valuable. In his lengthy introduction to the printed edition, he says that the narrative in manuscript form gives scholars access to a text written by a Black woman or man, unedited, unaffected, unglossed, unaided by even the most well-intentioned or unobtrusive hand. In other words, free of editorial contamination. And by accessing such a text, scholars would be accessing, quote, the mind of a slave in an unmediated fashion heretofore not possible. Gates' attempt to minimize his own editorial judgments and choices, as we've been talking about today, claiming that the manuscript is a counterpunch to the contaminating presence of white amanuenses, editors, benefactors, and abolitionists in what remains of the early Black archive. He contends that through manuscript, scholars could not simply come to know Crafts, but they could come to know her more intimately than if they were reading her text in print. Such an editorial theory is predicated on the juxtaposition of the authorial hand of composition and the editorial hand of print and its attendant processes. If printed texts occlude authorial presence, then manuscripts allow for unadulterated, unmediated encounters. While printed texts are blueprints that can help scholars read for and delineate social networks, social hierarchies, and the fetters of historical contingency, manuscripts are the secret trapdoors into human consciousness. Thus, the printed as-is narrative aspires to stand in for its original holograph, which is itself a so-called surrogate for the author herself. And here I want to pause for a moment just to note that the Gates as-is edition is thus far the only printed edition of the bondwoman's narrative. From a teaching perspective, this creates a few points of engagement, but also a few problems. So the prefatory material suggests that the design of the printed edition is as close as possible to that of the holograph. One might be tempted in that case to teach the printed book to the exclusion of the manuscript, or to teach the manuscript as a supplementary reference rather than a central concern. The printed edition offers the best of both worlds: consistent, readable text, and, through its use of strike-throughs, the ineffable authorial presence that manuscripts give to readers. You know, those feelings of intimacy and curiosity that can arise when you encounter evidence of authorial decision-making. That's the theory of the book. That is not my theory of the book. If the printed book sparks enough curiosity to lead a reader to the manuscript with or without guidance from the instructor, the entire manuscript was well photographed and is easy enough to find on the Beinecke's library website. If Ashley wouldn't mind dropping that into the chat, or did I not give that to you? I'll just put it in later.
I don't have it, but I will find it, Sarah.
Wonderful. So here is a cropped picture of a page from the manuscript. And the first thing you might notice about it is that Crafts didn't strike through her text with precise lines that are easy to see through. And you might also observe that her lines are different textures. Up top, she uses neat vertical parallel lines, and down below, she thickly smudges out her text with horizontal lines. I'm happy to say more about what this means to me or what it implies about how this was composed, but right now I'm just going to move along. And finally, you may note, if you look carefully, that there is a compositional feature that is visible in the manuscript, but that is absent from the printed edition. If you look at the line above Craft's very dark strike through, where it begins, you'll see that she inserted the word trunk with the caret symbol. And I apologize because I did choose a passage that has some particularly violent language around lynching. It's just the pictures that I had, and that's why I'm using it. It's not in any way to make a point. But so I've zoomed in for easier comparison, and you can see, along with a word processed representation, how it appears in the printed edition. So caret editions are ubiquitous in the manuscript, and it's just one of the many features that doesn't get translated into print. I'll give you a second to just sort of see the difference. So in addition to carets, paste overs, which are also missing from the printed edition, provide in the manuscript a temporal texture that shows Craft's text to be not simply a record of excision, but also one of addition. The absence of carets and paste overs gives the impression that she was writing in an ever forward-looking and spontaneous manner, rather than in a deliberate, readerly, and recursive one. So where we are led to believe that we are seeing her slave consciousness play out before our very eyes in print, we are actually reading a twice edited text. First, it was edited by Crafts, as we're seeing in the images I'm showing. And then second, it was edited by Gates in the printed edition. Yet, in renouncing his own editorial labor, Gates puts the full onus of the text, its intentions, its errors, the glory and the guts, solely onto Crafts. And I'll conclude by showing an example that spells this out. It spells out the risk of the as-is style. So in an edition like the printed bondwoman's narrative, which is not rendered in clear text, and for the most part is not corrected, it is common to see authorial error. Crafts misspells words, and uses her punctuation idiosyncratically. If and likely when the reader of the printed text becomes inured to the sight of benign editorial neglect and gentle correction, no textual oddity will seem out of place. Therefore, when readers of the as-is edition of the narrative come upon passages that seem wrong or inconsistent or syntactically bizarre, rather than reflect on the reality that print is a mode wherein many custodians of a text are responsible for the final product, wherein the move from pen stroke to keystroke is an act of translation, they are encouraged to wonder what conditions led Crafts to her errors. And her errors can then be palpated for signs of life. For instance, spelling mistakes could be read self-evidently as the product of Crafts' autodidactic literacy. Similarly, other grammatical peccadillos might be read as providing access to her deeper psychological motivations. Take, for instance, a scene near the end of the narrative where Crafts narrates her heroine avatar, Hannah's encounter with a brother-sister duo who have also escaped into the woods on their journey north. The sister is desperately ill and expires, flanked by her loving brother and a bewildered Hannah. As she slips away, the sister and brother share final words. In the printed edition, the conversation appears as follows. Sorry about the picture, COVID. My dear sister, he said, bending his mouth to her ear. And she says, I hear, but I can't see you. Is the sun arisen? It is, it is. See it now. It is coming, a light, a very bright light. The sun came, the light arose, the light of righteousness, dead. Crafts has, for some strange reason, made the sister call herself it instead of I. One scholar responded to this scene by arguing that it shows Crafts making the authorial choice or a Freudian slip to objectify the dying woman. This is because, he argues, Crafts disidentifies with Black women and rejects the strictures of Black womanhood. And here that scholar, I won't name him, is talking about Crafts, the author, not Hannah, the narrator. In this moment, the objectification, the author's veil of, in this moment of objectification, the author's veil of pseudonymity can give her psychological impulses no cover. In this psychoanalytic reading, it hardly matters if the move to it was a choice or an error on behalf of Crafts, because either way, it says a lot about her as an author. Turning to the manuscript, however, it becomes apparent that Crafts did not write it. Rather, whoever transcribed that portion of the manuscript into print did. So readers might be shocked to know that there are mistakes in the printed narrative, and they are not attributable to Crafts. And they're also not simply failures to translate the palimpsestic texture of manuscript to the smooth printed page. Indeed, the as-is style makes it near impossible to spot editorial error when it happens. To interpret the printed edition of the narrative without checking it against the manuscript counterpart is to hazard making claims about textual events that did not in fact take place. And finally, in conclusion, for real, as I've already suggested, while purporting to bring the text and not to mention Crafts herself into clearer view, the as-is style of the printed edition creates its own conditions of readerly reception, many of which are quite different from those of the manuscript itself. The discrepancies between the printed edition and the manuscript may at first seem simply to register the unavoidable truth that translation is always imperfect, and that print with its standardized repertoire has a limited capacity to render all of the variable expressions of manuscript form, from the varying line quality of a strike through to the three-dimensional extrusion of a pasted over section of a page. But in fact, my purpose is not to conceive of a more perfect print version of Crafts' narrative. What is significant to me about the editorial theory behind Gates' practice of non-intervention is its unstated premise, which I take to be that to be a mistaken faith in the transmissibility of writing itself, and in the ability to convey something realer or purer or closer to human by drawing it closer to the originary act of composition. Non-intervention, as it is performed in the as-is printing style, presumes that to illustrate the generative and genetic movements of a manuscript is to reveal something otherwise unknowable about the person who produced the text. And I'm going to stop here, but my main point is that in this way, you can actually forget that the manuscript that we have before us is itself already edited and formed and shaped like a book, and has intentions toward being a book, and has intentions toward being a representation or set of representations as opposed to confessional whatever. So we can use textual studies, editorial theory to resurrect composition and revision and to reconstruct authorial processes, but we cannot reconstruct people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the whole panel for this really great intersecting weaving of concepts. I feel like syllabi are going to change, and that may be a good thing. So we don't have a whole lot of time, but we do have time for some questions and discussions. So I want to, in particular, invite the audience to put any questions or comments that you might have in the chat, and then I'll read them out, and we can, and the panelists can speak to them. So we have some kind words in the chat, people thanking the panelists. But if there are any questions that people would like to pose, please go ahead and do that. Go ahead and do that now.
You want me to pose a quick one while we're waiting for a chat?
That would be lovely. Please do.
I think everyone here, I noticed, no one, we only touched on it, was we all use digital facsimiles in different ways and acknowledged it in digital ways. And I'm just struck by how our knowledge of the book allows us to frame and not frame that. So I put it out there as an easy question while someone's writing. Anyone can pick it up. I guess it's not a question, it's observation. Why? What do you think?
What, can you say a little bit about the different ways that you see people using the digital?
Sure. Well, so I mean, the example that struck, right? So Sonia used images of books that she, I assume, did not purchase from book dealers, right? So these are, she can trust them and she understands how they work. And there's a mercantile thing, right? We're assured of their authenticity because she might potentially buy them, so they would not be lying. Meredith used high quality institutional digitizations with, you know, the evidence of their quality, right? The little marker on the side. And Sarah actually cut and framed, like I tend to do, the digitization she got from Beinecke, right? And I assume you've worked with the object as well to inform this sort of thing. And so what I'm noticing is just like, those are three very different ways of approaching digital surrogates. They're all informed by knowledge of the object under it. And I guess maybe the question is, was that intentional or not? Maybe that's too vague as a question, Elizabeth. I think I'm failing us.
No, no, it's terrific. I just was interested in hearing your thoughts. I thought it makes me think about, in relationship to the course that we teach, that in fact using the digital archive is or digital versions of manuscripts, that it raises issues similar to what Sarah was talking about in her talk, which is that there is a certain illusion of non-mediation. And so the question, I mean, what you're doing is sort of foregrounding the different models of mediation. And I think that's actually tremendously important because of the danger of imagining that if you have a digital facsimile of a manuscript, that you would therefore have transparent access to it. So one of the other parts of the course of that same course is that we have the students build an archive of materials themselves. And a lot of what's at stake in building the archive is for them to, it's less the question of reproducing the material than structuring the metadata for the material. And so, in other words, what is the knowledge system through which this material will be framed and accessed? So that question of framing, again, speaks to the issues of mediation, I think, that has come across in all of the text. But I do think that there's a danger of imagining that mediation doesn't exist, and in digital form. Even the labor, of like who's making the digital images, who's storing them, who's paying for it, all of those questions are significant. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I was going to weigh in as well. And I guess this is the point where I get to give a shout out to JP, who actually was my collation tutor at Rare Book School, right? So I'm really aware when I'm teaching with these digitized materials that the way that I can do it is very much informed by the access that I've had and the privilege that I've had to actually touch things. And a lot of this thinking that I've been doing on Bradstreet in particular expanded greatly in fall when everything was online and I had a print culture class, where we're doing this. And I think at the kind of introductory, intermediate level survey class, it's enough to get them thinking about editions and to feel like you have a pretty good surrogate for them. I did find that with my print culture seminar, that we went a lot more into issues of remediation and what that meant, so that class was able to think both about how editions carry their own interpretive structures and how surrogates do as well. And they became very, very interested in issues of remediation as a kind of an interpretive mode. But again, they were doing that at a different level. We were supplementing it with a lot of things. I will say that it can be, I was trying to use very good surrogates, but sometimes a bad surrogate can be really helpful as well. And I'll use an example from a book history class where I had an online lab with it. And if you look at, there's a digitization of Hooke's Micrographia, where they've only digitized the side of the leaf that has an image on it. And because there's all these engravings inserted in, the rectos and versos start shifting around. And so one lab, the only thing they had to figure out was, why are some of these pages, why is the even an odd number in the wrong place? And that was the lab to figure that out. So I think you really need to call attention to that sort of meta level of the surrogate and the remediation.
Yeah, I think we're officially out of time, but I'm going to just read into our discussion a comment here from Sarah to the panelists that I think is important. Or do you want to say it, Sarah? Sarah, why don't you say it?
I think that's my name twin. That's not me.
Sarah Robbins? Oh, okay. All right, so from the other Sarah Robbins, she writes, we talked this morning about how editing is undervalued as intellectual work. How can we bring a similar attention to the intellectual work of teaching that empowers students to be editors? I love this question because I think that inviting students not to be passive recipients, but active creators is really, it's just tremendously valuable for them and makes all the light bulbs go off in new ways. So I don't know if anybody wants to say a word or two. I'm seeing Ashley, so.
Yes, you are seeing me. I don't know, we have one question from John Bryant for Sarah. She might be able to address it quickly. Sarah, have you actually examined the paste overs? You have?
Yeah, so just very quickly, I know that the person who did the forensics of the book was able to reconstruct some of what's underneath each of the paste overs, and she's recycling already used paper from elsewhere in the manuscript. So stuff that she's canceled, she cuts up and writes on the back and uses. And for the most part, she fits each paste over to exactly how much space she needs and revises the exact amount, with one exception where there's a glaring sort of bit of negative space. And that's the one time where the revision is just shorter than what was underneath.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for these fantastic presentations. I am going to have to watch them a couple of times, I think, to pick up on everything. And we hope that you'll all attend tomorrow as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.